This is part 3 of chapter 10 of The Order of Things by Michel Foucault. Chapter 10 called The Human Sciences, part 3 of chapter 10, The Three Models. At first glance, one could say that the domain of the human sciences is covered by three sciences, or rather by three epistemological regions, all subdivided within themselves, and all interlocking with one another. These regions are defined by the triple relation of the human sciences in general to biology, economics, and philology. Thus, one could admit that the psychological region has found its locus in that place where the living being, in the extension of its functions, in its neuromotor blueprints, its physiological regulations, but also in the suspense that interrupts and limits them, opens itself to the possibility of representation. In the same way, the sociological region would be situated where the laboring, producing, and consuming individual offers himself a representation of the society in which this activity occurs, of the groups and individuals among which it is divided, of the imperatives, sanctions, rites, festivities, and beliefs by which it is upheld or regulated. Lastly, in that region where the laws and forms of a language hold sway, but where, nevertheless, they remain on the edge of themselves, enabling man to introduce into them the play of his representations. In that region arise the study of literature and myths, the analysis of all oral expressions and written documents. In short, the analysis of the verbal traces that a culture or an individual may leave behind them. This division, though very summary, is probably not too inexact. It does, however, leave two fundamental problems unsolved. One concerns the form of positivity proper to the human sciences, the concepts around which they are organized, the type of rationality to which they refer and by means of which they seek to constitute themselves as knowledge. The other is their relation to representation, and the paradoxical fact that even while they take place only where there is representation, it is to unconscious mechanisms, forms, and processes, or at least to the exterior boundaries of consciousness, that they address themselves. The controversies to which the search for a specific positivity in the field of the human sciences has given rise are only too well known: genetic or structural analysis, explanation or comprehension, recourse to what is underneath or decipherment kept strictly to the level of reading. In fact, all these theoretical discussions did not arise and were not pursued throughout the history of the human sciences, because the latter had to deal in man with an object so complex that it was not yet possible to find a unique mode of access towards it, or because it was necessary to use several in turn. These discussions were able to exist only insofar as the positivity of the human sciences rests simultaneously upon the transference of three distinct models. This transference is not a marginal phenomenon for the human sciences, a sort of supporting framework, a detour to include some exterior intelligibility, a confirmation derived from sciences already constituted. Nor is it a limited episode in their history, a crisis of formation at a time when they were still so young that they could not fix their concepts and their laws themselves. On the contrary, it is a matter of an ineffaceable fact, which is bound up forever with their particular arrangement in the epistemological space. We should indeed distinguish between two different sorts of model utilized by the human sciences, leaving aside models of formalization. On the one hand, there were, and often still are, concepts introduced from another domain of knowledge, which, losing all operational efficacy in the process, now play only the role of an image. Organic metaphors in 19th century sociology, energy metaphors in Janet, geometrical and dynamic metaphors in Lewin. But there are also constituent models, which are not just techniques of formalization for the human sciences or simple means of devising methods of operation with less effort. They make it possible to create groups of phenomena as so many objects. For a possible branch of knowledge, they ensure their connection in the empirical space, but they offer them to experience already linked together. They play the role of categories in the area of knowledge particular to human sciences. These constituent models are borrowed from the three domains of biology, economics, and the study of language. It is upon the projected surface of biology that man appears as a being possessing functions, receiving stimuli, physiological ones, but also social, interhuman, and cultural ones, reacting to them, adapting himself, evolving, submitting to the demands of an environment, coming to terms with the modifications it imposes, seeking to erase imbalances, acting in accordance with regularities, having, in short, conditions of existence and the possibility of finding average norms of adjustment which permit him to perform his functions. On the projected surface of economics, man appears as having needs and desires, as seeking to satisfy them, and therefore as having interests, desiring profits, entering into opposition with other men. In short, he appears in an irreducible situation of conflict. He evades these conflicts, he escapes from them or succeeds in dominating them, in finding a solution that will, on one level at least, and for a time, appease their contradictions. He establishes a body of rules which are both a limitation of the conflict and a result of it. Lastly, and on this projected surface of language, man's behavior appears as an attempt to say something. His slightest gestures, even their involuntary mechanisms and their failures, have a meaning. And everything he arranges around him by way of objects, rites, customs, discourse, all the traces he leaves behind him, constitute a coherent whole and a system of signs. Thus, these three pairs of function and norm, conflict and rule, signification and system completely cover the entire domain of what can be known about man. It must not be supposed, however, that any of these pairs of concepts remains localized on the projected surface on which it may have appeared. Function and norm are not psychological concepts exclusively. Conflict and rule do not have an application limited wholly to the sociological domain. Signification and system are not valid solely for phenomena more or less akin to language. All these concepts occur throughout the entire volume common to the human sciences and are valid in each of the regions included within it. Hence, the frequent difficulty in fixing limits, not merely between the objects, but also between the methods proper to psychology, sociology, and the analysis of literature and myth. Nevertheless, we can say in a general way that psychology is fundamentally a study of man in terms of functions and norms. Functions and norms which can, in a secondary fashion, be interpreted on the basis of conflicts and significations, rules and systems. Sociology is fundamentally a study of man in terms of rules and conflicts, but these may be interpreted, and one is constantly led to interpret them in a secondary way, either on the basis of functions, as though they were individuals organically connected to themselves, or on the basis of systems of significations, as though they were written or spoken texts. Lastly, the study of literature and myth is essentially the province of an analysis of significations and signifying systems. But we all know that this analysis may be carried out in terms of functional coherence or of conflicts and rules. In this way, all the human sciences interlock and can always be used to interpret one another. Their frontiers become blurred. Intermediary and composite disciplines multiply endlessly. And in the end, their proper object may even disappear altogether. But whatever the nature of the analysis and the domain to which it is applied, we have a formal criterion for knowing what is on the level of psychology, what on that of sociology, and what on that of language analysis. This is the choice of the fundamental model and the position of the secondary models, which make it possible to know at what point one begins to psychologize or sociologize in the study of literature and myth, or at what point in psychology one has moved on over into the decipherment of texts or into sociological analysis. But this superimposition of several models is not a defect of method. It becomes a defect only if the models have not been precisely ordered and explicitly articulated in relation to one another. As we know, it proved possible to conduct an admirably precise study of the Indo-European mythologies by using the sociological model superimposed upon the basic analysis of significant and significations. We know also, on the other hand, to what syncretic platitudes the still mediocre undertaking of founding a so-called clinical psychology has led. Whether properly founded and controlled or carried out in confusion, this interlocking of constituent models explains the discussions of method rather referred to above. They do not have their origin and justification in a sometimes contradictory complexity which we know as the character proper to man, but in the play of oppositions, which makes it possible to define each of the three models in relation to the two others. To oppose genesis to structure is to oppose function in its development, in its progressively diversified operations, in the powers of adaptation it has acquired and balanced in time, to the synchronism of conflict and rule, of signification and system, to oppose analysis by means of that which is underneath, to analysis on the same level as its object, is to oppose conflict. A primary, archaic datum inscribed at the same time as man's fundamental needs to function and signification as they are deployed in their particular realization. To oppose comprehension to explanation is to oppose the technique that makes it possible to decipher a meaning on the basis of a signifying system to those that make it possible to give an account of a conflict together with its consequences, or of the forms and deformations that a function and its organs may assume or undergo. But we must go further. We know that in the human sciences, the point of view of discontinuity, the threshold between nature and culture, the irreducibility one to another of the balances or solutions found by each society or each individual, the absence of intermediary forms, the non-existence of a continuum existing in space or time, is in opposition to the point of view of continuity. The existence of this opposition is to be explained by the bipolar character of the models. Analysis in a continuous mode relies upon the permanence of function, which is to be found in the very depths of life, in an identity that authorizes and provides roots for succeeding adaptations. Upon the interconnection of conflicts, they may take various forms, but they are always present in the background. Upon the fabric of significations, which link up with one another and constitute, as it were, the continuous expanse of a discourse. On the contrary, the analysis of discontinuities seeks rather to draw out the internal coherence of signifying systems, the specificity of bodies of rules, and the decisive character they assume in relation to what must be regulated, and the emergence of the norm above the level of functional fluctuations. It might be possible to retrace the entire history of the human sciences from the 19th century onward on the basis of these three models. They have, in fact, covered the whole of that history, since we can follow the dynasty of their privileges for more than a century. First, the reign of the biological model, man, his psyche, his group, his society, the language he speaks. All these exist in the Romantic period as living beings, and insofar as they were, in fact, alive, their mode of being is organic and is analyzed in terms of function. Then comes the reign of the economic model. Man and his entire activity are the locus of conflicts, of which they are both the more or less manifest expression and the more or less successful solution. Lastly, just as Freud comes after Comte and Marx, there begins the reign of the philological, when it is a matter of interpretation and the discovery of hidden meanings, and the linguistic model, when it is a matter of giving a structure to and clarifying the signifying system. Thus, a vast shift has led to the human sciences from a form more dense in living models to another more saturated with models borrowed from language. But this shift was paralleled by another with that which caused the first term in each of the constituent pairs: function, conflict, signification, to recede, and the second term, norm, rule, system, to emerge with a correspondingly greater intensity and importance. Goldstein, Mauss, Dumézil may be taken to represent as near as makes no difference, the moment at which the reversal took place within each of the models. Such a reversal has two series of noteworthy consequences. As long as the functional point of view continued to carry more weight than the normative point of view, as long as it was not on the basis of the norm and the interior of the activity determining that norm, that the attempt was made to understand how a function was performed. It was, of course, necessary, de facto, to share the normal functions with the non-normal. Thus, a pathological psychology was accepted side by side with normal psychology, but forming, as it were, an inverted image of it. Hence, the importance of the Jacksonian notion of disintegration in ribot or genet. In the same way, a pathology of societies, Durkheim, of irrational and quasi-morbid forms of belief, Levi Brule Blondel, was also accepted. Similarly, as long as the point of view of conflict carried more weight than that of the rule, it was supposed that certain conflicts could not be overcome, that individuals and societies ran the risk of destroying themselves by them. Finally, as long as the point of view of signification carried more weight than that of system, a division was made between significant and non-significant. It was accepted that there was meaning in certain domains of human behavior, or certain regions of the social area, but not in others, so that the human sciences laid down an essential division within their own field. They always extended between a positive pole and a negative pole. They always designated an alterity based furthermore on the continuity they were analyzing. When, on the other hand, the analysis was conducted from the point of view of the norm, the rule, and the system, each area provided its own coherence and its own validity. It was no longer possible to speak of morbid consciousness, even referring to the sick, of primitive mentalities, even with reference to societies left behind by history, or of insignificant discourse, even when referring to absurd stories or to apparently incoherent legends. Everything may be thought within the order of the system, the rule, and the norm. By pluralizing itself, since systems are isolated, since rules form closed holes, since norms are posited in their autonomy, the field of the human sciences found itself unified. Suddenly, it was no longer fissured along its former dichotomy of values. And bearing in mind that Freud, more than anyone else, brought the knowledge of man closer to its philological and linguistic model, and that he was also the first to undertake the radical erasure of the division between positive and negative, between the normal and the pathological, the comprehensible and the incommunicable, the significant and the non-significant. It is easy to see how he prefigures the transition from an analysis in terms of functions conflicts, and significations to an analysis in terms of norms, rules, and systems. Thus, all this knowledge within which Western culture had given itself in one century a certain image of man pivots on the work of Freud, though without, for all that, leaving its fundamental arrangement. But even so, it is not here, as we shall see later on, that the most decisive importance of psychoanalysis lies. In any case, this transition to the point of view of the norm, the rule, and the system brings us to a problem that has been left in suspense, that of the role of representation in the human sciences. It might already appear extremely contestable to include the human sciences, as opposed to biology, economics, and philology, within the space of representation. Was it not already necessary to point out that a function can be performed, a conflict can develop its consequences, a signification can impose its intelligibility, without passing through the stage of explicit consciousness? And now, is it not necessary to recognize that the peculiar property of the norm in relation to the function it determines, of the rule in relation to the conflict it regulates, of the system in relation to the signification it makes possible, is precisely that of not being given to consciousness? Are we not forced to add a third historical gradient to the two already isolated, and to say that since the 19th century the human sciences have never ceased to approach that region of the unconscious where the action of representation is held in suspense? In fact, representation is not consciousness, and there is nothing to prove that this bringing to light of elements or structures that are never presented to consciousness as such enables the human sciences to escape the law of representation. The role of the concept of signification is, in fact, to show how something like a language, even if it is not in the form of explicit discourse, and even if it is not being deployed for a consciousness, can in general be given to representation. The role of the complementary concept of system is to show how signification is never primary and contemporaneous with itself, but always secondary and, as it were, derived in relation to a system that precedes it, constitutes its positive origin, and posits itself little by little in fragments and outlines through signification, in relation to the consciousness of a signification. The system is indeed always unconscious, since it was there before the signification, since it is within it that the signification resides, and on the basis of it that it becomes effective. But because the system is always promised to a future consciousness, which will perhaps never add it up, in other words, the signification system pair is what ensures both the representability of language as text or structure analyzed by philology and linguistics, and the near but withdrawn presence of the origin, as it is manifested as man's mode of being by means of the analytic of finitude. In the same way, the notion of conflict shows how need, desire, and interest, even if they are not presented to the consciousness experiencing them, can take form in representation. And the role of the inverse concept of rule is to show how the violence of conflict, the apparently untamed insistence of need, the lawless infinity of desire are in fact already organized by an unthought, which not only prescribes their rules, but renders them possible upon the basis of a rule. The conflict-rule pair ensures the representability of need, of the need that economics studies as an objective process in labor and production, and the representability of the unthought that is unveiled by the analytic of finitude. Lastly, the concept of function has the role of showing how the structures of life may give rise to representation, even though they are not conscious. In the concept of norm, how function provides its own conditions of possibility and the frontiers within which it is effective. Thus, it can be understood why these broad categories can structure the entire field of the human sciences. It is because they span it from end to end, because they both hold apart and link together the empirical positivities of life, labor, and language, on the basis of which man first detached himself historically as a form of possible knowledge, and the forms of finitude that characterize man's mode of being, as he constituted himself when representation ceased to define the general space of knowledge. These categories are not, therefore, mere empirical concepts of rather broad generality. They are indeed the basis on which man is able to present himself to a possible knowledge. They traverse the entire field of his possibility and articulate it boldly in accordance with the two dimensions that form its frame. But that is not all. They also permit the dissociation, which is characteristic of all contemporary knowledge about man, of consciousness and representation. They define the manner in which the empiricities can be given to representation, but in a form that is not present to the consciousness. Function, conflict, and signification are indeed the manner in which life, need, and language are doubled over in representation, but in a form that may be completely unconscious. On the other hand, they define the manner in which the fundamental finitude can be given to representation in a form both positive and empirical, yet not transparent to the naive consciousness. Neither norm nor rule, not system, is given in daily experience. They run through it, give rise to partial consciousnesses of themselves, but can never be wholly illumined except by a reflexive form of knowledge. So the human sciences speak only within the element of the representable, but in accordance with a conscious-unconscious dimension, a dimension that becomes more and more marked as one attempts to bring the order of systems, rules, and norms to light. It is as though the dichotomy between normal and pathological were tending to be eclipsed in favor of the bipolarity of consciousness and the unconscious. It must not be forgotten, therefore, that the increasingly marked importance of the unconscious in no way compromises the primacy of representation. This primacy does, however, raise an important problem. Now that the empirical forms of knowledge, such as those of life, labor, and language, have escaped, now that the attempt to define man's mode of being is being made outside the field of representation. What is representation, if not a phenomenon of an empirical order, which occurs within man and could be analyzed as such? And if representation occurs within man, what difference is there between it and consciousness? But representation is not simply an object for the human sciences. It is, as we have just seen, the very field upon which the human sciences occur, and to their fullest extent. It is the general pedestal of that form of knowledge, the basis that makes it possible. Two consequences emerge from this. One is of a historical order. It is the fact that the human sciences, unlike the empirical sciences, since the 19th century, and unlike modern thought, have been unable to find a way around the primacy of representation. Like the whole of classical knowledge, they reside within it, but they are in no way its heirs or its continuation. For the whole configuration of knowledge has been modified, and they came into being only to the degree to which there appeared with man a being who did not exist before in the field of the episteme. However, it is easy to understand why every time one tries to use the human sciences to philosophize, to pour back into the space of thought what one has been able to learn of man, and one finds oneself imitating the philosophical posture of the 18th century, in which, nevertheless, man had no place. For by extending the domain of knowledge about man beyond its limits, one is similarly extending the reign of representation beyond itself, and thus taking up one's position once more in a philosophy of the classical type. The other consequence is that the human sciences, when dealing with what is representation, in either conscious or unconscious form, find themselves treating as their object what is in fact their condition of possibility. They are always animated, therefore, by a sort of transcendental They never cease to exercise a critical examination of themselves. They proceed from that which is given to representation to that which renders representation possible, but which is still representation. So that, unlike other sciences, they seek not so much to generalize themselves or make themselves more precise as to be constantly demystifying themselves, to make the transition from an immediate and non-controlled evidence to less transparent but more fundamental forms. This quasi-transcendental process is always given in the form of an unveiling. It is always by an unveiling that we are able, as a consequence, to become sufficiently generalized or refined to conceive of individual phenomena. On the horizon of any human science, there is the project of bringing man's consciousness back to its real conditions, of restoring it to the contents and forms that brought it into being, and elude us within it. This is why the problem of the unconscious, its possibility, status, mode of existence, the means of knowing it, and of bringing it to light, is not simply a problem within the human sciences which they can be thought of as encountering by chance in their steps. It is a problem that is ultimately coextensive with their very existence. A transcendental raising of level that is, on the other side, an unveiling of the non-conscious, is constitutive of all the sciences of man. We may find in this the means of isolating them in their essential property. In any case, we can see that what manifests this peculiar property of the human sciences is not that privileged and singularly blurred object which is man, for the good reason that it is not man who constitutes them and provides them with a specific domain. It is the general arrangement of the episteme that provides them with a sight, summons them, and establishes them, thus enabling them to constitute man as their object. We shall say, therefore, that a human science exists not wherever man is in question, but wherever there is an analysis within the dimension proper to the unconscious of norms, rules, and signifying totalities which unveil to consciousness the conditions of its forms and contents. To speak of sciences of man in any other case is simply an abuse of language. We can see then how vain and idle are all those wearisome discussions as to whether such and such forms of knowledge may be termed truly scientific, and to what conditions they ought to be subjected in order to become so. The sciences of man are part of the modern episteme in the same way as chemistry or medicine or any other such science. Or again, in the same way as grammar and natural history were part of the classical episteme. But to say that they are part of the epistemological field means simply that their positivity is rooted in it, that is where they find their condition of existence, that they are therefore not merely illusions, pseudo-scientific fantasies, motivated at the level of opinions, interests, or beliefs, that they are not what others call by the bizarre name of ideology, but that does not necessarily mean that they are sciences. Although it is true that any science whatever, when it is questioned on the archaeological level and when an attempt is made to clear the ground of its positivity, always reveals the epistemological configuration that made it possible. Any epistemological configuration, on the other hand, even if it is completely assignable in its positivity, may very well not be a science. It does not thereby reduce itself ipso facto to the status of an imposture. We must distinguish carefully between three things. There are themes with scientific pretensions that one may encounter at the level of opinion and that are not, or are no longer, part of a culture's epistemological network. From the 17th century, for example, natural magic ceased to belong to the Western episteme, but it persisted for a long time in the interaction of beliefs and effective valorizations. Then there are epistemological figures whose outline, position, and function can be reconstituted in their positivity by means of an analysis of the archaeological type. And these, in turn, may obey two different organizations. Some present characteristics of objectivity and systematicity, which make it possible to define them as sciences. Others do not answer to those criteria. That is, their form of coherence and their relation to their object are determined by their positivity alone. The fact that these latter do not possess the formal criteria of a scientific form of knowledge does not prevent them from belonging, nevertheless, to the positive domain of knowledge. It would thus be as futile and unjust to analyze them as phenomena of opinion as to contrast them historically or critically with scientific formations proper. It would be more absurd still to treat them as combination which mixes together in variable proportions rational elements and other elements that are not rational. They must be replaced on the level of positivity that renders them possible and necessarily determines their form. Archaeology, then, has two tasks with regard to these figures: to determine the manner in which they are arranged in the episteme in which they have their roots, and to show also in what respect their configuration is radically different from that of the sciences in the strict sense. There is no reason to treat this peculiar configuration of theirs as a negative phenomenon. It is not the presence of an obstacle nor some internal deficiency which has left them stranded across the threshold of scientific forms. They constitute in their own form, side by side with the sciences and on the same archaeological ground, other configurations of knowledge. We have already encountered examples of such configurations in general grammar or in the classical theory of value. They possess the same ground of positivity as Cartesian mathematics. But they were not sciences, at least for the majority of those who were their contemporaries. Such is also the case with what we today call the human sciences. Of completely positive configurations. But as soon as these configurations and the way in which they are arranged within the modern episteme are determined, we understand why they cannot be sciences. What renders them possible, in fact, is a certain situation of vicinity with regard to biology, economics, and philology or linguistics. They exist only insofar as they dwell side by side with those sciences, or rather beneath them, in the space of their projections. However, they maintain a relationship with those sciences that is radically different from that which can be established between two related or germane sciences. This relationship presupposes, in fact, the transposition of external models within the dimension of the unconscious and the consciousness, and the flowing back of critical reflection towards the very place from which those models come. It is useless then to say that the human sciences are false sciences. They are not sciences at all. The configuration that defines their positivity and gives them their roots in the modern episteme at the same time makes it impossible for them to be sciences. And if it is then asked why they assumed that title, it is sufficient to recall that it pertains to the archaeological definition of their roots, that they summon and receive the transference of models borrowed from the sciences. It is therefore not man's irreducibility, what is designated as his invincible transcendence, nor even his excessively great complexity, that prevents him from becoming an object of science. Western culture has constituted, under the name of man, a being who, by one and the same interplay of reasons, must be a positive domain of knowledge and cannot be an object of science. That's the end of part 3 of chapter 10 of The Order of Things by Michel Foucault.